We're lucky to have a very esteemed panel with me today to answer questions from me, but more importantly, a bit later, questions from you too. On my right, your left is Nick Pearce, who is now the boss of the IPPR. Many of you will know used to work very closely with the former Prime Minister, Gordon Brown. On my left, Jesse Norman, Conservative MP, Conservative philosopher and thinker, some people describe him as, and a current member of Team Osborne in the sort of wings, not sure.
Adjunct supporter, blimey.
Adjunct to the Chancellor, so very useful for this morning. And on my far left, John Longworth, who is the new boss of the British Chambers of Commerce, very experienced board director, a man with fingers in many pies, and importantly, somebody who actually runs businesses. And not always enough of them actually in this square mile. So, this morning we're going to be focusing on the very big question of what next for the economy. Last night the Governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, said rather cheerfully, time is running out. And while making it plain he felt policies for now were appropriate, to use his word, he also made it pretty clear that in his view you can't go on like this. Whether he was just talking about quantitative easing or if he was talking more generally, who knows? Maybe that's something we'll pick up on in our discussions. But what we're going to do, just a bit of housekeeping, we're going to look in detail at 4 different topics. First, the vexed question of credit easing, then looking ahead to what should be on the Chancellor's to-do list for the autumn statement. Then we're going to touch on the Vickers review. I think some of you here are from the banking sector, and whether or not that will be a help or a hindrance to getting the economy going. And lastly, we'll be touching on what would Labour actually do differently and what are the other alternatives that are out there contrasted to the government's policy. So first of all, we're just going to talk about credit easing, and just also as we go through, I'm going to ask each of the panel in turn about the topics, but please, if there's something you really want to get in there, please do wave your hand up and stick your hand up. We'll have a chunk of time for questions at the end, but as we go through, if there are things that you really want to get stuck into, please do tell me. So first of all, credit easing, just one first bit of audience participation. Stick your hand up if you think you actually know what it is. That makes me feel so much better. I should know, and I'm not entirely sure of the details. So Jesse, firstly to you as adjunct to Team Osborne, what do you understand it actually to be? And crucially, could it actually get going anytime soon to counter the problems that we currently face?
Well, I think the idea, it sounds so loud. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Right, it's
stalling.
Yeah, it's fine. Okay, so what is credit easing? Well, the broad principle is the idea of relieving some of the blockage in the lending to the small and medium-sized enterprise sector by making available credit directly in a way that's analogous to quantitative easing. So the thought would be that you would buy up some existing debt in the system, and in that sense it's rather analogous to factoring, which already takes place, where you essentially sell your debts off and you're able to bring cash in exchange for those. What are the details? Well, the truth of the matter is I don't know what the details are, and I don't think anyone does yet. This is new territory. The broad principles are fairly clear, but what we don't know are exactly how it would work. And there are 2 specific problems that would have to overcome to make a system really work. One is it would have to overcome a problem of what you might call state aid. The worry would be this, the European Union bans the provision of credit, inexpensive or out-of-the-money credit to, or other financial support to private institutions from states. So is this a form of state aid? And it would have to be raised so it isn't a form of state aid. That's a rather technical matter. The second question is, how do you stop what you might call negative selection? That is to say, how do you stop all the bad companies coming forward, all the dodgiest debts they have, and asking the government to buy them out at 100p in the pound? I think I've just, no, at 100p in the pound. And all the good companies essentially being pushed to the back of the queue. Now, we saw a rather extreme case of negative selection with in the Eurozone crisis with banks' holdings of Greek sovereign debt, where broadly speaking the ECB asked the Germans and the French banks not to offload their holdings of debt, and guess what? The French very happily offloaded every penny they could, sold it into the ECB, which has probably become technically insolvent as a result, and the Germans haven't. That's the kind of problem you want to avoid, but the details will have to wait for the autumn statement.
And just very briefly, do you think actually it should be the Treasury directly buying up small business debt, or would it have to be some other standalone organisation that other people have been talking about? Because the Bank of England very clearly does not want to get into this, picking winners and giving direct aid to companies. So briefly, who should actually do it?
Well, I think it can't be a direct organ of government. There has to be some credit function involved, and it might be that there are private institutions that could help with that. There might be need to be a separate.
Not a public institution.
Well, or there might have to be a separate sui generis public institution. That's a further part of the design of the package.
Okay, John, when you heard this idea, did you think that the people you speak for up and down the country would be thinking, gosh, this is the answer to our prayers? Is it an idea you're interested in, or do you just think it's something that's too far down the road to be useful?
Well, we're very interested in it. It's an idea we actually asked for, not specifically credit easing, using treasury money, but we asked for a further tranche of quantitative easing from the Bank of England, but with the proviso that the money actually goes into what I call the real economy. Either or both are extremely welcome, providing that it in fact does stimulate real business development and growth. Of course, there are caveats around that. Clearly, we don't want too much inflation. At the moment, the biggest issue is growth, even though inflation is pushing up a bit. Nonetheless, if there is no growth, then we'll end up in a much bigger mess. I would have liked to have seen the Bank of England itself find a mechanism for putting money into the real economy. And there are a variety of ways in which this could have been done. For example, the Bank of England could buy private debt from commercial banks, and thus, with the stricture on the commercial banks, that they then have to lend the equivalent amount of money that's freed up to commercial organisations. We've also suggested the Bank of England should have a negative interest rate for the commercial bank holdings at the Bank of England to prevent banks hoarding surplus funds at the central bank. Well, it doesn't prevent them, but it certainly encourages them to use it in another way. Otherwise, they will lose any value from that holding. You have to excuse me, Mum, I've got slight laryngitis, so I hope you can hear me okay. In relation, and that's not been brought on by credit easing. It might be brought on a little later when I'm asked a question about the advanced 5 points, because I can never remember what they are. But, on credit easing itself, I think that we don't know what it means at the moment, so it's extremely important that we have a really good understanding of how it will work in practice if we are to in fact support it in fact. When I was asked at the time that the announcement was made what I thought about it, I tried to describe what I think it should be, hoping that the government might actually decide that that's in fact how they would do it. But we still don't know, and every government department, as you said already, has no idea what it means, and neither does the Bank of England, as far as I can see from conversations with the bank. So we just have to wait and see how the mechanism will work. The one thing I'm absolutely certain of is that it's a matter of the utmost urgency. And one of the things that I find frustrating about government generally is that governments do not act with any sort of level of urgency. We are at the moment in positive growth mode. If we were to have a negative growth figure in the next growth results, we would be into facing the possibility of another recession. We don't need to have a recession in the UK, but we do need to provide working capital for businesses that are growing. And the final word on this from me, would just to illustrate this point, is that our Q3 survey of businesses, and the Chairman Network represents over 104,000 businesses up and down the country, generally in, again, the real economy, shows that there's still a high degree of positive sentiment amongst manufacturers, and particularly also amongst exporting manufacturers, but it's slowing down. And the reason it's slowing down is that all these businesses are concerned about the future, investing in the future, but more particularly, we are concerned about getting access to working capital to enable them to keep growing. And it's when businesses start growing and the economy starts picking up that they actually go bust because they cannot afford the working capital necessary in order to build that trade and that business. So the whole export-led shift in the economy is going to be starved of oxygen if we don't do something about this as a matter of urgency.
Okay, John, thank you. Now, Nick, as somebody who's been around the policy block in Westminster very many times, do you actually have a sense credit easing might be one of these things suggested at conference and then it just melts away?
No, I think the Chancellor wouldn't have announced it at conference if it wasn't going to happen. So I firmly expect it to be in the autumn statement. I mean, I think there's a prior problem about demand and business confidence. Corporates have got big balance sheets at the moment. Not the case necessarily for SMEs, but you know, the broader problem we have, and we can come on to this in the next session, next section, is about investment opportunities and business confidence. But in respect of credit easing, Adam Posen, the member of the Monetary Policy Committee, gave a speech about a month or so ago, a very, very good speech, in which he argued for two things. One, more quantitative easing, which has since come to pass, and secondly also for a small business investment bank, which would do lending directly to small businesses. And that may be the path that is chosen. The problem with it, as others have indicated, is the speed at which it would take to get that going, particularly if you have to legislate for it. Of course, it could take a long time. And so it seems to me probably the likeliest option is that the Treasury says to the big banks, we'll take your small business loan book, buy up your small business loan books, or a certain proportion of them, and in return you'll lend to new businesses, or you'll make new lending to businesses against lending agreements. And the downside of that is that we've been there before with the banks that we recapped, that lending agreements were signed and they weren't met, or at least they weren't met in ways that have helped the economy to grow. So the downside of the sort of quick action via the main banks, who after all have over 90% of the market, is that you might have the kind of problems we've seen before. One way of getting around that is to try and foster some sort of competition to create or to fund institutions that might more directly get through to SMEs. For example, yesterday I was talking to a new company, it's about a year old. It's an online venture called Funding Circle. It allows small investors to fund loans to SMEs of their choice, or bundles of SMEs directly, very low cost because it's internet-based, overheads minimal. It's growing very, very fast, particularly with SMEs that can't get loans off the banks. And so if there was some more competition, if there were different vehicles chosen, if the Treasury could find ways of doing both volume and getting some, at the margins, some competition into this framework, then it might be more successful.
And just very briefly, did you, when you were part of government, did you ever look at that idea? Of the Treasury actually buying up small business loan books, other than the big bailouts?
No, I mean, at the time, when I was in Number 10, the issue that dominated was, the too big to fail, the big banks and the recapitalisation of them, and the lending agreements that were signed with them as a consequence, and other things like tax and spending decisions, deficit reduction, and so on, dominated in that period. The last government to want to directly lend to small businesses was Harold Wilson's government in the 60s.
Good bit of trivia for you. Take that and tell you wow your colleagues later through the day. It'd be really interesting to hear from any of you in the audience. I don't know if any of you are from the banking sector. I think from the list some people were, as to whether or not that is something that would be appealing if you think it could work or have any ideas about it. But I can see everybody feels a bit shy at the moment, so we'll move on to our next sector. So more broadly then, and I'd like to go to John first. In terms of the autumn statement, I know that you at the BCC have some quite specific ideas. You've alluded to some of them. But what is the number one priority that you want to be in there, that your members need to be in there?
Okay, well, the number one priority, sad to say, is credit easing. So we'll move on from that to the other priorities. There are a number of things that we think that the Chancellor could do in the autumn that would help to stimulate business growth and jobs. One of the things I must say straight away, though, is that we're completely certain that we should stick to Plan A. So anything that is done should be done within the spending envelope that is already set out. And then there is actually quite a bit of wriggle room within Plan A, of course, because if the growth is lower and tax receipts are lower, you can legitimately say that the government has to do more within Plan A in order to maintain the balance of the plan. So that aside, Plan A is a starting point, because certainly even the businesses that are finding it the toughest that I talk to are saying that actually to move away from deficit reduction programme would be a catastrophe. It would make things even worse, because there'd be no stability in the economy. We'd be facing the possibility of all sorts of things going wrong. We'd end up with stagflation and all sorts of things. But obviously, there's a risk of that even now, but abandoning Plan A would be almost a dead cert way of achieving it.
So given that's not going to happen, we don't expect that to happen, what then is
The plus to it for us is that we should redirect spending into things that will help to stimulate business growth, such as enterprise allowances, extending the holiday period for employers' national insurance contributions. There are things that the government can do which wouldn't cost the government anything at all, of course. For example, actually delivering a deregulation programme, which I sat on the deregulation task force 21 years ago, and I haven't actually seen government deliver anything meaningful in relation to red tape reduction and deregulation in 21 years. So that would be a major plus. We also think that the government should stimulate infrastructure development. Part of helping to do that, of course, is actually a change in the planning regime, which will enable planning authorities to say yes rather than no. And I'm really talking about in relation to business development now. This is not tarmacking Wimpole Hall and Downton Abbey. It's actually developing extensions to businesses in business areas.
I think you've just given the National Trust a really good idea to recruit Lady Mayor.
So those are the sort of things that we're really looking for. If things get really bad in the economy, we will have to look at the ring-fenced areas temporarily, because we have to actually create the money to invest in business development. If we don't create wealth in the UK and we don't have business growth, we won't be able to afford anything that we want in the future. Hospitals, education or pensions, and our children's future will be bleak.
John, just briefly, what is your definition of things getting really bad? A negative figure in Q3 or?
No, worse than that, I think. I mean, we're getting to it if we end up with another recession. But if there's a Eurozone meltdown, I think all bets are off. We're into a completely different situation now.
And Jesse, I'd like to enlighten us all into how much wriggle room there actually is in Plan A, because clearly George Osborne has made enormous political capital out of it, sticking to the plan, clearing the whole deficit by 2015. As John says, you know very well, there is actually some wriggle room, which is not necessarily very widely known. In the simplest terms that you can, could you explain to us how that wriggle room works?
Well, I'm not sure I think there is that much wiggle room in the plan. I mean, the broad point of the plan is to reduce the structural deficit over the life of the Parliament. Now, the structural deficit is immune, in theory, to changes in the economy, because it's the portion of the deficit that doesn't get paid back through the business cycle. So that part of the plan remains as it is. The real question is what happens to the debt figure as revenues change versus spending. And what we know is that spending is obviously high because we're essentially in a recession still. And I actually don't buy the idea that we've ever really come out of the recession. I think we've been in a recession for 3 or 4 years, and whatever the numbers really say. And that's not obviously the official position of the Conservative Party, and certainly not of the Chancellor, but it is my view. And it also depends on tax receipts, and tax receipts have been slightly better than people were expecting. So we don't quite know what that is. I think what the real point actually is not how much wiggle room there is within Plan A. It is how does the economy start to be moved by measures that aren't just about, as it were, the supply side, which inevitably take 1 to 3 years, and aren't given that we can't afford a demand-side fiscal stimulus of the kind that's being proposed on the opposite side of the House. My view actually is that this is just an intractable dilemma. We have to deal with that. We have to manage our way through it. There isn't a solution to that problem. The one thing I have suggested, or I I do think is that there is much more scope to spend on infrastructure, which is a demand side change. I think there's you know, it's not for me to make a decision, but I think there's a scope to spend a significant amount more without imperiling our credit rating. And I think that could be done in a way that makes the assets created and the liabilities incurred explicit and could give a significant stimulus to the economy. But that would have a near-term effect as well as a structural supply side effect. And I think that would be an interesting feature in the autumn.
And that sounds like something that some of your Liberal Democrat colleagues in the coalition would be very fond of hearing. How widely shared is that in Conservative circles, even at the doors of the Treasury?
I think the question is, could it be done in a way that doesn't imperil the credit rating or the position that we're taking on debt? Because of course the Chancellor's taking a very strong position on debt, and that turns out to have been, and for something which is getting no credit at all, frankly, in the general public, an incredibly important and brave decision. It wasn't an obvious thing to do at the time. As you see how the Eurozone, which is absolutely tottering at the moment, degenerates, that's looking very good. I mean, just a classic example, we had the German finance minister in on Monday. The German finance minister is in some denial about this issue at the moment. There's no doubt even the French credit rating is under risk. So our position is looking quite good.
But how then would you said you thought you could bring forward infrastructure spending without affecting the debt rating. How would you do it? And briefly.
The way I would do it, and this comes out of all the work I've been thinking on with PFI, which, as you know, I regard as a bit of an abomination. Well, I mean, I don't deny there are good projects, but spending 3.5% more than we should for a project is not particularly clever, which is what it costs now. So what you would do is to explore the idea of setting up separate pools of assets that would be which would be held with assets and liabilities. So we don't have a national balance sheet at the moment, so you've no idea what the assets being created are when you incur a liability. And that means that the debt rating agencies tend to look at the debt, they don't consider what the assets and the balance sheet is. So I think there's an opportunity now to put those two things together. It might take a modest amount of credit enhancement from the Treasury, but there are plenty of things that would be very inexpensive. You'd be borrowing more or less flat on gilts, and you could be spending quite a lot of money on infrastructure. So that's an idea I think we should be thinking about.
Nick, if
Well,
we're up to you and you were advising now, what would you, within the political confines, what would you be advising to be instead?
Well, there is one big bit of wiggle room for the Chancellor, which is that his target is to reduce the structural deficit, or to eradicate the structural deficit by 2015-16, but his current plans assume that he'll do it by 2014-15. So he can slip it back a year, and if the Financial Times is right in a story it had some weeks ago, it used the Office of Budget Responsibilities model for calculating performance against the structural deficit. It said actually we're going to be 12 billion short of the Chancellor's plans this year. Basically, it did that because you reached that conclusion because it said the economy had contracted more than was thought in the recession, and its capacity was weaker, principally because of what happened to financial services. For my part, I do believe that fiscal policy has to play more of a role. If you've got effectively zero interest rates, and you haven't got enough demand in your economy, and there are problems in your export markets, then government has to step in and spend more. And I agree with Jesse that infrastructure should be our priority. I was in number 10 when we took the decision to halve capital spending, government capital spending, a decision which the coalition subsequently roughly stuck to. It improved the position of transport spending and cut housing spending much more dramatically, but basically that's what's happening. And we did that simply because that's how the numbers added up. We couldn't raise any other taxes or cut any other spending. It wasn't because it was a good decision to cut infrastructure spending, it's simply that that's how it needed to do to make the overall deficit reduction picture that Alistair Darling set out work. So I would like to see more investment in transport infrastructure, in housing. We need to build more houses in this country. The cost of government borrowing is very low at the moment. I do think there is potential, rather like Jesse, for sort of reverse PFI, that government borrows and then leases out to the private sector. The Chancellor, in his conference speech, announced funding for the Mersey, an extra toll bridge on the Mersey. That's a good example. Basically, you've got an income stream coming in from tolls for that. You know what your revenue stream is. That can justify the cost of the upfront capital investment. So I would like to see more capital investment, particularly on transport and housing, more pragmatism on fiscal policy. You can still stick to a deficit reduction plan, but do more in later years when growth has returned and less now. That's what I would be saying. Be more pragmatic, use fiscal policy now when you need to, get more capital investment going, perhaps create a state investment bank, as people have argued, and I would do things on the employment side, much more for youth unemployment, bring back some version of the Future Jobs Fund for young people, a jobs guarantee for the long-term unemployed, and to help families reverse the cut in childcare support.
A long list there. Jesse, I know you briefly want to come back in.
Just very quickly, I do think that it's very important not to be too, as it were, sanguine about pushing, bringing spending forward and pushing off the pain. If you look at the parallel cases of the kind of recession we're in at the moment, and don't forget, this is not a P&L recession, it's not one that goes through the profit and loss statement through, as it were, decline in sales, loss, recovery, profit, and this is a fundamental recalibration of value. Think about Japan, 10 years in recession. Think about the US in this country in the 1930s. You know, Roosevelt made very little difference, actually. Contrary to what you might say, with hyperactivity in terms of politics, what rescued the US from recession was the Second World War. And, you know, we could easily be there for a number of years. So bringing forward spending isn't necessarily, as the Japanese model shows, by any means a panacea, and might leave you even more exposed in the latter years of a plan.
Okay, now quickly I want to touch on the Vickers report and what Labour might do differently, and then open up to questions. So I'm going to ask all the panel to crunch our contributions down a little bit. John, with your business, small chambers viewpoint, is the Vickers review actually going to make any difference? Because for banks, we're already seeing some banks actually having a harder time making money, if you believe some reports already. Some customers walking away from some banks if you believe reports already that are coming. Surely actually it's going to make it more expensive for your members to borrow in a market where they're already having difficulty to accessing finance.
Yeah, I mean, in short, it could do. I mean, one of the things that we've been very keen to emphasise is that actually the priority at the moment is actually getting business growth and wealth creation. It's actually, in terms of the, we've gone from a highly risky economy to a highly risk-averse economy across the board in both business and government and banking. And actually, there needs to be some rebalancing in that. And our concern was that the Vickers report might have gone too far in the risk-averse end of that equation. However frustrated everybody is about the banking sector and the way it behaved, nonetheless, it is in itself a very important sector of the UK economy in which we have differential advantage. And I'm sure that a lot of our competitors will be delighted to see us kill our own differential advantage sector. Secondly, it is actually, and its primary role, which actually I think it in a sense forgot, is to actually facilitate the real economy and growth in the real economy. So it's hugely important that the banking sector is well resourced to be able to do that. Of course, it also has to have the will to do it. It's very difficult if you're a bank, you're being asked to recapitalise, you're being told to recapitalise, and you're being told simultaneously to lend money. You can't do both things simultaneously. So the provision of money for private sector development either has to bypass the banks in some way while the banks recapitalise, or the government has to recalibrate what it wants the banks to do, would be my view. I think that the QE that the Bank of England put in, all the indicators to me were whether the Bank of England was putting money into the banks to recapitalise even further to protect them against potential bank collapses in Europe. That money was not heading for business, unfortunately. My feeling about it is that, in a sense, there's almost two sets of QE necessary. One to actually go into the real economy and one to actually protect the banks from future shocks. So it's a very complicated and difficult area. I have both sympathy and concern in relation to the banks. And actually, the two players in the scenario now that have the most responsibility in this whole area to deal with these issues are the Bank of England and the government.
Not the banks themselves. It's very interesting. It's one of the interesting things about Vickers' proposals is, in a sense, the political consensus that grew up around them. It isn't in the case, excuse me, to an extent, it's all about the politics. It's not actually about a sensible reform of the banking sector.
Well, it's certainly true that anybody that appears soft on the banks is, courting political suicide at the moment. And so it's in nobody's interest to look as if they're soft on anything that Vickers recommends. whether in the government or on the opposition benches. I mean, for my part, I think the reforms seem pretty sensible. I'm not an expert in the banking sector. I think they seem pretty sensible, although I think we could go further in respect of things like regional banks and banking closer to the real economy. But I do think the broader question for Britain is, we have seen over the last 30, 35 years, significant growth in the financial sector, what people call the financialisation of the economy, very similar in the US, goes hand in hand with rising inequality, stagnant real wages, and higher household indebtedness. And the question for us is, what does that all mean? Do we need to protect the city because it's one of the few areas in which we have genuine international competitive advantage, a legacy of the sterling area, imperial preference, etc., time zones and all the rest of it? Or is this actually, damaging us because it's making our economy unbalanced, both across different kinds of sectors of activity, across the regions, and also across different levels of, the class structure? And for my part, that's the bigger, longer-term question that needs addressing here.
And what's your view?
Well,
what should we do?
I think it will be important to try and get more of our productive investment into the economy in the future and less in the city. Yeah.
Okay. And Jesse, briefly if you can, on Vickers, isn't it very curious that we have a Conservative-led government making it harder for banks to do business?
No, I don't think it's curious at all. We are very much looking for a proper critique of crony and financial capitalism from the right of the political spectrum. And Vickers isn't a political statement as such, but it's a very important reflection of a new discipline. And I would agree with Nick that there needs to be more balance in the economy, and that the financialisation of the economy has not by any means been an undiluted benefit. I mean, very quickly, just to remind ourselves the problem. When the times were good, the financial sector was throwing money at the problem. Now times are bad, they've slammed the brakes on. So in other words, it's operated in precisely the opposite way to the way in which it would actually have benefited the real economy in many ways. Vickers is trying to strike a balance between protecting and supporting the financial sector while injecting proper protection for depositors and protection for the taxpayer. And that's incredibly difficult at the moment because the Eurozone is almost out of control. Let me just remind you very quickly what the situation in the Eurozone is. 3 months ago, 4 months ago, you could get 6-day money if you were borrowing as a bank. Now you're down to 20 to 30 days. 6 months ago or a year ago, the ECB was expecting to fund a few European banks. Now the list of banks being directly funded by the European Central Bank is as long as your arm. The Eurozone, whatever happens to the Eurozone in terms of the Greek default, the Eurozone could come apart on the basis of the money markets for bank borrowing alone. So we're in a serious crisis here, and it's very important for us to remember that. So Vickers' recapitalisation actually of the banks has proved rather important. When you think of the effect we're going to be the eventual Eurozone bailout, we will be relatively less effective with the exception of RBS, potentially, because of the recapitalisation that's taken place. The problem is that there may well be an additional burden from the way in which Vickers has done it on the small and medium-sized enterprise sector. And the reason is because those guys get funded by the ring-fenced entities. The ring-fenced banks will have higher capital costs. And where are those charges going to be passed on to? The answer is it's unlikely, in my view, that the employees of the banks will absorb much of the cost. They'll get passed on. Where will they get passed on? To the areas with low market power. Who are they? They're not the large corporates, they're the small corporates. Well, that's a relatively small part of the business. And they're also potentially the retail depositor.
Okay, now please do get ready to answer your questions. Ask your questions. While I just ask Nick, what in concrete terms would Labour do right now, in your view, to kickstart the economy? Not the medium, longer term vision, but right now.
Well, I mean, the Labour Party has a plan, tax the banks more, invest in housing, cut VAT for home improvements, a set of measures which it believes will stimulate the economy. Now, the big difference is that Labour does think that demand is a problem and we're cutting the deficit too fast. The big problem for Labour is that it might be right now, but that won't translate into people trusting them on the economy in the future, and certainly not on the public finances. But Labour has got a job to do still at the next election for people to say, well, that party can be trusted with my taxpayers' money.
And what would you advise them to do to restore that credibility? Have you seen any signs from the new-ish leadership that they actually have an answer to that?
I don't think myself that gross overspending was the cause of the deficit. The deficit was caused by a collapse in our tax revenues because our economy was too dependent on revenues from the city, from stamp duties, housing market, wealthy individuals and so on. We didn't have a broad enough tax base, so it wasn't gross overspending. If I were Labour, I would say, look, we were too hands-off with the economy in these areas. That meant that we were exposed when the crisis came in a way that other countries with more resilient economies and broader tax bases weren't. Our deficit was nearly 12% of GDP, the Germans 3.5% for the same loss of output. I mean, they had a recession as deep as ours, and their recession was their deficit was a quarter of ours. So I would say that, and I would say, we can't spend our way to social democracy in the future. So to be fiscally conservative, we've got to be economic reformers, and that's the path that seems to me that can get them back to some sort of contention on the economy in the future.
And how far away are they from doing that now?
Well, the polls show they're quite a long way away, but not because of the arguments they're making at the moment. It's because of this sense that Labour screwed it up. It's not because at the moment people don't think that actually, they might be right about current policy.
Okay. Now, over to you. Who wants to ask the first question about any of the topics that we have covered? Don't be shy. Yes, and also if you could say who you are and what company you're from, that was helpful.
Darren Captain, Chief Executive of the Airport Press Association. So I was interested in comments on infrastructure. And in our game, there's no policy at all. So come be more there. And we've got the highest air passenger use in the whole world. And it's going up next year. So my question is actually a lot of talking about spending, but actually a lot of the tax side. With the VAT cut, Labour looking a little bit at that curve, but have the Conservatives totally given up on the idea of actually trying to reduce tax to stimulate the economy? Or are spending plans going to keep going up and up and up?
Jesse.
Well, hold on a sec. Corporation tax has already fallen. There's a 3-year plan in place to reduce it further. There's no doubt that the government is doing whatever it can to flag a direction towards low taxes. However, the situation we're in doesn't allow that at the moment. Now, let's just focus on one little aspect, and I might just take issue with one aspect of the only thing I know about Labour's 5-point plan, which is the VAT cut. It's terribly simple to talk about VAT cut, but let's just look at the numbers for a second. 12.5 billion quid cost from a VAT cut of 2.5%. Well, that's how much stimulus does that give to the economy? Say it gave £12.5 billion worth of stimulus to the economy. In other words, say all that money was immediately spent straight back. It would only then give you the tax return on 12.5 billion quid, which might be 3.5, depending on how you measure it. So what you're immediately looking at is a £9 billion increase in debt. Now, that's the problem in general. What's the solution? The solution has to be targeted tax cuts to give particular prompts that liberate animal spirits. But there's no way it can be a large-scale tax cutting at this stage in the economy because we're in a debt crisis.
But there are also some tax increases coming downstream for business. If the Chancellor follows convention and business rates go up by the inflation rise, that's another £1.5 billion or so rise in business rates next year. Should they go ahead with that, or do you think he might delay it?
I don't know what the Chancellor do on that. I haven't looked at the numbers remotely, and the inflation, it slightly depends on how you think about the inflation rise, whether you just take the 5% of this month as somehow canonical, or whether you look at it over the period of time. No one thinks that the inflation, the actual embedded inflation rate, is 5% at the moment, or few people do, because we're teetering in this kind of bipolar situation where it's the conventional, the kind of standard economic opinion appears to be that it's either 5% or inflation. So I wouldn't suggest that's not a real 5%. I just mean to say that there's some reason to think that it might not be 5% in a year's time.
Do you want to come back?
Yeah, in our game, tax duty, the actual revenues levels are higher than banking tax over the next 4 or 5 years. And you can have a very easy remedy. This is just don't go up any further. But we're not getting indications. I'm sure it's the same in other fields as well. So why not send out signals that says, okay, we're not going to reduce taxes necessarily, but let's not keep them up even further. And we all know very tough economic times. And that's the concern. I think a lot of business would like to say, well, let's have that signal. Let's not make it even harder for ourselves in the years ahead.
Okay, next question. Dharma, never shy.
Laura, I just wanted to ask one about consumers, about personal incomes. Over the next 2 or 3 years, it looks like real personal incomes are set to fall, and they've held up okay in the last couple of years. David Cameron got into a bit of bother just before the speech about what government should do with that, whether they should pay down debt or continue to spend. What do the panel think consumers should be doing to respond to that fall in real incomes, and what should the government be doing to address that?
Okay, John, what should consumers do? Should we be paying down our credit cards, as the Prime Minister was going to suggest and then mysteriously didn't? Or should we be outspending?
Yeah, well, he wisely didn't suggest that. I mean, the interesting thing is that consumers are, in fact, paying off their debt. Actually, consumers are being personally very responsible in a way that sometimes, I guess, governments in the past have not been. People are trying to put their own affairs in order, and that's personal choice, and long may it remain personal choice. It's entirely the consumer's choice to do that or not. What we have to deal with is the public debt.
No.
Well, as we all know, the paradox of thrift is that if we all pay off our debts at once, then the economy, will shrink. And people pointed that out to the Prime Minister, and he changed his speech, as Laura said. Of course, individuals must make their own decisions about their own household finances. Actually, the Office of Budget Responsibility projects that household debt will increase in the next period, in the next 3 to 4 years, and that's the only way, really, that you can make the numbers on growth stack up, because you can't assume heroic things about export performance or other business investment and so on. So if you get a collapse in consumer demand, then the economy will just shrink even further.
And that's very interesting. You suggest there, in your view, the only way to get growth back is on the back of personal debt.
Well, I don't think that, consumption is 2/3 of the economy. We definitely need to export more, we definitely need to invest more. I think government can give a lead, as I was saying earlier, through things like infrastructure investment and so on. But if consumers start to pay down their debts rather than spending, then the economy will shrink, there's no doubt about that.
Okay. We are already seeing a lot of evidence of that, people paying off mortgages and paying off credit cards. So Jesse, what could the government do to get people spending again without encouraging them to take decisions that put their own finances at risk?
Well, of course, whether people spend is a function of what their views are about the future, largely. And if people feel optimistic about the future, then they are encouraged to bring forward spending, and if they don't, then they won't. So the key thing is to move towards a resolution of some of the key decision-affecting areas of the environment. So what is happening in the Eurozone? What is happening in is there some sense of emerging out of the economy? As soon as people seem to see that, they'll start to discount that. If you think prices are going to be lower in the future, then you will wait for them to be lower. You won't spend now. I don't think the Prime Minister was giving macroeconomic advice when he asked people, he encouraged people to pay down their debts, or thought about it. He was saying, and in part this is true of a lot of people actually, of course, that saving, however important it is an enormous issue of personal indebtedness, and people in a responsible way should be thinking of doing that. And actually that's very good personal advice, and it's just the other half of the paradox of thrift, that there's no point racking up more debt personally or indeed saving when you could be paying off your debt. I would like to see one thing which is a Conservative policy from the 2005 election, and I know because I wrote it, but I still think it's a great idea, which is a lifetime savings account, which would allow people to take money out and put it in over the course of their life, and not just primed by tax relief. Because there's an awful lot of people in this country who do save and would like to save, but aren't big taxpayers, and there are going to be fewer in the lower demographic, socioeconomic segments who are able to save using tax relief, as more of them get taken out of the tax system. So new forms of saving vehicle, I think, that allow people to save over their lifetimes are of some value, and I think it would be a good thing to introduce them earlier and allow this current generation to start feeling that it's got a stake in its own future, rather than just feeling oppressed by economic events.
Just briefly, do you think some of the political language, perhaps more earlier in the year, perhaps with the kind of language that Vince Cable used during the conference season, that paints a very gloomy, very bleak picture, has actually perhaps been a mistake because, excuse me, it's contributed to the lack of confidence we're seeing on the high street?
I think it's terribly difficult for politicians because the public wants two things that are incommensurable. It wants to feel reassured and confident, and it wants them to tell the truth. And in circumstances like this, those things come apart. The truth is, we're in a hole. The good news is, we'll get out of the hole. But, how you balance that message is difficult. And it's not a bad thing to have one person saying one thing and another saying another, because that does reflect a genuine diversity of views. Prime Minister's just, I think, a more optimistic personality, and I think he's got reason to be optimistic given what I think he's doing to the economy.
Thank you. Next question. Gentleman there, and imagine if you could say where you're from.
Yes, Andrew Lynn, I'm home team Fishermen Hedges as well. I want to ask a quick question on the structural deficit, which you touched on earlier. I think sort of Osborne, actually both parties in the coalition have sort of presented the elimination of the structural deficit as almost being the raison d'etre of the government. I want to ask what the panel think the political implications would be of missing that target, and if Osborne has to go to the country in May 2015 saying there have been serious public sector cuts, living standards have fallen, and we still haven't reduced the structural deficit, what does that mean for prospects of re-election?
Great question.
Well, in the US, there's an academic who does this thing called the bread and peace model, and he uses it to predict US presidential elections. And it's the bread bit is living standards, the peace bit is US troops committed overseas, Vietnam, Afghanistan, so on. And the bread bit is not done on growth or unemployment; it's done on per capita incomes and living standards. And it's a very, very tight fit to US election results. And at the moment, he's predicting Obama will squeak in. But if you transplant that to the UK, you'd say living standards will be the key determinant of the electoral fortunes of the government of the next election. Labour, in its third term, had a 0 increase in living standards. It was flat over that term compared to big increases in its first term, smaller increases in its second, but nonetheless still increases. And I think it was punished severely for that. So you can expect there to be a problem, whatever actually at the next election, because of this hit on living standards. The IFS said 7% by the election. Now, if you haven't reduced the structural deficit, what does it say to the public? Well, I think it's inconceivable that we won't have gone a long way towards reducing it by then. But there is increasing talk in political circles of people saying, we will need to carry on cutting in the next parliament. And of course, the logic of Labour's position that you have a slower deficit reduction path now implies that after the election you're still cutting. So we're not going to be in an election where sort of goodies jam tomorrow, because that clearly won't be very plausible.
John, how much would it affect the credibility, do you think, of the Chancellor if he had to admit, actually, it's going to take longer? Perhaps even if in the autumn statement there was a hint, maybe from the Office of Budget Responsibility, that it might take a bit longer than people expected.
Not for me to comment on political outcomes. Well, there are two things I've taken out of this morning's session. I've written it down here. Defending the bank's political suicide. So I'm clearly not going to be a politician, am I? Which is a good thing, very probably. And the other thing is that we should declare war, because that's clearly the answer to the session.
I think some governments have tried that.
They have indeed.
It's a kind of standard essay question. What this country needs is a small war.
Victorious war as well. It's a small victorious.
A small victorious war. It's a very good question. I actually, there's a slight Mandy Rice Davis, he would say this, wouldn't he? But I don't think that it is perceived by the general public as the raison d'etre. I think what the general public wants to know is, we're taking control of the finances and we're not going to go down the Swanee because of European or other financial problems. And so those will be the key tests. I don't think 1 in 100 members of the general public understands what the structural deficit is, and I'm thrilled about that because it's a daft piece of wonkism for economists. So that will be the question. Now, actually, the public isn't stupid. This is a great conceit of politicians. The public is extraordinarily intelligent. There's very rare occasions they've made the wrong decision in a general election. And I think that what they could easily do is see the situation as we have. They might say, listen, these guys haven't quite hit the political target, but they're out there slugging, and we're a lot further ahead than we would have been, and we've avoided the fate of everyone in Europe from Greece up to France, potentially, of taking a hit on your credit rating and potentially national immolation. In so doing, so I think that's really going to be the question that people will be asking themselves, and I think the political implications of that could be favourable. I mean, we could be in a hole, and yet people will re-elect the government, because I think actually this is the best shot for improving living standards, the best shot for a better future for their children.
But yet, in Westminster circles, which do matter, I absolutely take your point about the general public not knowing or necessarily caring what the structural deficit actually means. But it would it not, be a hit for George Osborne's credibility if he has to admit he's not going to hit his target? He's completely constructed his political narrative around that. He took people by surprise by his courage in saying he'd do it all in 5 years. It wouldn't hit him, wouldn't it?
I don't really think so. I mean, frankly, look at Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt got re-elected 3 times. Okay, when the first 2 of those were in peacetime. Now, why did that happen? Had the US economy emerged, by the end of the 1930s? Absolutely not at all. So, I mean, it was still struggling. So I don't really buy that. I mean, if you think about what the Chancellor actually, I think, came to a very simple judgment, which is, has this government been elected to have this country going further into debt at the end of 5 years than it is now? I don't know the aggregate, but the rate of increase of debt. The answer is no. So, in other words, we've got to take control of the situation. That's what I think people will judge him for.
Okay, and I think we've probably got time for one or maybe two more questions. Gentleman there.
I'm Richard Wilson from Tiger. Tiger is the trade association that represents the UK video games industry. The panel were talking earlier on about the need to promote the productive sectors of the economy. That's often shorthand out of manufacturing, which is really important. But I don't think we've seen from either of the key parties any real concrete policies about helping the creative industries. We talk about reducing corporation tax, which is good, but a lot of creative industries in the early years don't make profits anyway. So we've seen both governments have supported the film industry very successfully through a film tax credit. At the time, we recommended a tax break for games production, which would stimulate the video games industry, which is a growth industry globally. But more generally, why can't the coalition parties come up with a sensible set of policies to help the creative industries as well as manufacturing?
Okay, good question. And probably an under-discussed thing, I would imagine. Creative industries growing very fast, particularly the gaming industry. John, do you think the creative industries get enough attention and enough of an influence on setting policy?
I don't think business, actually, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises, gets enough attention at all. I mean, generally speaking, business is not in the heads of government. In this administration, it's probably in the heads of Treasury and Biz, probably not in the heads of most other departments. In most administrations, it's not in the heads of Biz even, as from my experience. Just to emphasise, within our network of 104,000 businesses, we have all sorts of businesses, not just manufacturing businesses. I believe all business, provided, and I've quoted on this before, provided it creates wealth, pays its taxes and abides by the law, all business is good business, because it does what the economy asks business to do, whether it's creative industries, manufacturing, service sector or whatever. In fact, some of the biggest exporting, in inverted commas, businesses that we have are actually service industries, not necessarily manufacturing industries. Manufacturing does a great job. Service sector at the moment suffering very greatly, actually struggling in terms of export, but doing okay. But in the domestic sector, really under the cosh. So anything that helps business as a whole will help all business. All business is good, and we should encourage all business. We do need to rebalance the economy, no question about that. That doesn't mean shrinking parts of the economy. What it means is expanding all the economy and expanding some parts, hopefully faster. Certainly, providing specific stimulus to very specific sectors, I think, is something that's difficult to. What we need to do is create an environment in which all business can prosper.
Okay, John, thank you. And just briefly to the other two, specific things that can be done for the creative industry thing?
Well, I certainly agree that creative industries are important, on some estimates about 10% of the economy, and grew through the recession actually. Although of course it does depend how you define creative industries, and I agree that services are incredibly important, and there's no prospect of a big rise in manufacturing employment in this country, even if we can get more manufacturing strength back. I don't know enough about the gaming industry, I'm afraid, to advise on sort of tax breaks and so on, but I'm sure you've got a good case. Lots of people are making that case to the Treasury as we speak. Plenty of sectors will be lining up for tax breaks, but in some areas, it is valuable, as you say, the film industry did work.
Okay. And Jesse, brief final word to
you. Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's a bit of fudge, actually, the question. The truth of the matter is there are lots of creative industries, and they're a great success in this country, but it's not absolutely clear by any means that there's an overlap of any interesting kind between kinds of arts, certain kinds of arts and craft industry, which will call themselves creative, the video game industry. There are digitally distributed ones, which I think is what you're really referring to, but there are plenty of creative activities that should fall under that category that aren't included. One of the reasons why policy hasn't been as good as it could be, I think, is because you've got 13 segments in the DCMS all squabbling with each other, desperate for airtime, trying to do the others down. What we don't have is a coherent response from whatever the entity is called the creative industries that DCMS could engage with. but having said that, I don't think that policy is as well developed as it could be. What would it be doing? It would be supporting clusters and competition which allow the creation of intellectual property. It would be securing, but not over-securing, that IP. It would be helping finance to come in and support entrepreneurship used at leveraging that IP. We're terribly good at having ideas, terribly bad at rolling them out. And so those are the kinds of things we'll be doing. What we'll be doing otherwise, well, one thing the government's doing which is really good for the creative industries is supporting the Henley Review and thinking about music and building more music out in this country. I think that would be a fantastic thing. If you look at this one very small thought to end on, which is this. We're about to enter an enormous, and this is a reason for optimism, an enormous boom time in spending over the next 20 or 30 years from what used to be called the developing world. There's about to emerge a gigantic emerging market middle class, which is into which we could be selling vast numbers of very high quality value-added products. Classic, and that's not just us, that's also Europeans. So take Lang Lang, the famous Chinese pianist, he plays Schubert, right? These guys are buying Burberry. They could be buying a lot of our creative stuff. We're world leaders in music. Other creative industries, they could be buying that stuff. So we've got to be taking it seriously, but I think those creative industries could be doing a slightly better job of helping the government to think constructively about where they come at themselves.
I look forward to sending my consequences to you.
You can send them to ECMS and I'm sure they'll greatly enjoy it. Thank you.
I think that was a throwing down the gauntlet. Look, thank you all very, very much indeed for your contributions. You've touched on FDR several times, Jesse Kuznets, with particular punch on talking about him. Harold Wilson from Nick, a bit of Schubert at the end, just touched on there, all very highfalutin topics for early in the morning at a seminar in Westminster. But I think we've had some very interesting discussion. It clearly is a very, very important time. By coincidence, tomorrow is the anniversary of the Spending Review, which will give us all a chance to look back and see what's really happened and remind ourselves actually that despite a lot of the messaging from the government, public spending in total will actually still be more this year than last. And in case you haven't had enough of this stuff, there are only 40 days to go until the autumn statement itself. So plenty more time before then to discussion and plenty more time to have analysis afterwards. So thank you all very much to our panel, and if you'll join with me in